Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, 15 Security Fallacies We Still Commit in 2022. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Manager at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us is Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI at Sectigo. Hey, Jason, how are you?
Hello, Christian. Doing very, very well, thank you.
Great. And we also have Sectigo's PKI Product Marketing Specialist, Greg Mooney. Hi, Greg. How's it going?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, which we actually expect to be a little quicker, around 30 minutes, and will allow for questions and answers at the end. Well, that's it for me, Greg. Without further ado, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Kristen. And thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. It's a pleasure to all have you. And if you haven't heard the podcast yet, the 15 security fallacies that we all make when it comes to security. And on today's agenda, I'm going to be talking through with Jason here about, things that we kind of forget about, or maybe fundamentally we know our problems or know that are fallacies, but we kind of trip ourselves up with. If you've been in the data security field for as long as Jason, or I've been in the field for about 10 years myself, these things always seem, there's certain things that we do that we seem to forget, and we are going to go through all these misconceptions and all these fallacies, and we're going to well, really, what I want to start off with is, Jason, the first fallacy that we always seem to start or always seem to deal with is, kind of like usernames and passwords, and minimal controls being more useful. What and also, and this kind of ties into like legacy systems, legacy security. What are the main minimal controls that need to be useful, and what is the fallacy of a weak security measure?
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. So, in looking at all of these fallacies, just before we get into that first one, I got to say this comes out of talking to a lot of security professionals and hearing their opinions and hearing how they think. Unfortunately, security is hard. Let's recognize that first and foremost. And we're all dealing with limited resources. As you say, things like, legacy systems where maybe we can't get away from username and passwords, right? The problem isn't the what we're addressing, and the problem that we're talking about in this presentation isn't so much, hey, you somehow have to magically get rid of your problems with expenditure or procurement of a security product. This is simply about mistakes of assumptions that people are making. Let's get right into that question you
Mhm.
asked about username and passwords. And the problem is this: I still see technical journalism that says things like, even though NIST deprecated the changing of username and passwords every 90 days or 60 days, maybe we should go back to that. Oh, and by the way, if you just use enough Mongolian characters, your password will be tough enough to guess, and therefore, username and passwords are sufficient as long as you have the right policy around
We should be using wingdings, essentially.
it. Why not, Greg? Right? Why not? In fact, you and I were talking about what happens if you do things like, choose an extremely complicated password. What happens if you do things like use a customized username that comes from an email address that nobody's ever seen before? And what I said to you is absolutely that assumption is terrific if your only problem was the bad guys guessing or credential stuffing. But the
That
fallacy, the incorrect assumption being made is that that's where it ends. In other words, the bad guy doesn't have enough of a technology pipe to be able to deal with that that guessing problem. But the real problem is that the bad guy does have a technology pipe. In other words, social engineering that uses a fake authentication page will capture no matter what it is you type in, period.
Yeah.
As well, if you add in a problem of the compromised compromised network for man in the middle, or a compromised endpoint, they could be keylogging you.
Of
And so it
course.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you're using those wingdings or Mongolian characters, or as you said earlier, a completely different password. The problem is no amount of policy will protect you from using a minimum control that is below the technology pipeline of the bad guy.
No, that makes complete sense. And this really goes back to, the fundamentals of why, usernames and passwords are, obviously we're coming to a point where our digital identities are basically our actual identities, and we need to kind of rethink how we approach security and when it comes to just entering who we are, because we know the bad guys, they have a database filled with our names, with all our usernames and passwords, and it's super important that we can kind of divert maybe their attention or find other ways at a fundamental level to protect ourselves.
You got it. You got it. So therefore, right, if you're working with a legacy system, accept the fact that username and passwords are not enough. And if you cannot change that fact, then you need to create additional controls around it. Things such as either network monitoring, and we'll talk about that later, or things like network segmentation, which are really best practices. So in other words, don't depend on complexity of passwords to stop the guessing problem. That would be a fallacy. Understanding that you do have a problem and then understanding what you can do about it is the correct way to think about it. And unfortunately, in 2022, I still see technical journalism that commits this fallacy.
Yeah, and you know what? And it's unfortunate because you turn on CNN, you turn on any news station, and data security always comes up. There's always a big hack, and it's very simple things that we could have done to protect ourselves that basically have caused these things, and they aren't. It's not that we're trying to say like, listen, it's a matter of training, but it's also a matter of the media has not been very kind when it comes to understanding the issues at hand. I know from my own experience that I've had, family members, God forbid, they've been hacked, and it's unfortunate, and it's always been a simple matter of, either they're clicking on something they didn't mean to click on, or they were not paying attention, and it's when you call them out on it, it actually they can be a little, they can be a little aghast by it. But it's I actually want to ask you, Jason, in your experience, how do you approach, like, say, an end user, or say a family member or somebody who's making kind of the same mistake over and over again, or maybe they don't realize by habit what they're doing, and how would you approach that? Because
Well,
this yeah,
here is one way I would, by addressing fallacy number two,
yeah,
which is quite often the average person, especially a family member who might not be an IT specialist, whatever. Quite often they think, well, I'm too small to be a target. And that is the fallacy of the underdog. In other words, there's nothing I have that's of value to the bad guy. First of all, that's completely false from a fraud standpoint. And it's also false from, hey, what happens if you are a member of the civil service? You work for the government. What happens if you work for a large corporation? You're an HR person. You might be targeted simply because you have credentials that can get the bad guy further into whatever their target is. So therefore, committing the fallacy of the underdog is something we need to teach all of our family members. Everybody has something of value. Even if that thing of value is just something that could get the bad guy to collect free healthcare in Canada with social insurance numbers, social security numbers, healthcare health card numbers, that might be enough for the
mm,
bad guy to be able to commit fraud against your identity. You might not realize that that's an incredibly valuable asset you have that the bad guy wants. This happens every single day. We need to teach our family members that good security hygiene is important for everybody, no matter who it is.
No, security hygiene, and this is one that always hits home. And like just like you just said, Jason, it and this kind of goes into failure to match risk. A lot of IT teams or a lot of companies don't realize that if your employee gets hacked at home, chances are they're bringing it over to the business. And how much of a risk is that? And could you go into more about what do you mean really by failure to match risk?
Certainly, anytime that there is fraud, for example, anytime that there's money available to be stolen, let's I'll give you a perfect example. We all know now that SMS as a second factor was a really bad idea when it came to protecting against fraud. A lot of European banks had one-time passcodes sent by SMS simply because it was very simple, very easy. Everybody in Europe had SMS in their pocket. So therefore sending an OTP to deal with this problem of username passwords being, too minimal of a control, they thought, well, that's good enough. That's a high enough bar for the bad guy to have to climb over. They won't steal money that way. Turned out absolutely false. The bad guys did what it took to be able to do that. Next thing you know, you had immense amounts of Android malware being distributed very easily through social engineering, and hundreds of millions of euros and pounds being stolen because of, frankly, an incredibly weak form of second factor. In other words, SMS as a second factor is now deprecated by NIST. But up until that point, people who were professional security architects were failing to realize the risk level, the thing of value to the bad guy was worth more than you thought it was. They were willing and able to jump over the hoop you were giving them, and the difficulty to the bad guy was not hard enough. And that is the fallacy of failure to match risk, and I see that still to this day.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, I mean, in like if you've been like I was saying before, if you've been hacked in your personal life, they probably already have access to your phone. We've seen this. No, this is exactly why multi-factor authentication is being deprecated, as you said, and this is why we need to start rethinking how we approach these layered security approaches because it's essentially just a layered security approach to username and password.
Well, this is it. What layers you use have to be chosen very carefully. Just throwing a minimal layer isn't enough. And it's funny how some of these fallacies kind of climb on each other, and so therefore, it's the reason why some of these things might seem just intuitive or obvious, but in reality, if you start layering and layering and layering a lot of weak controls, all of a sudden you're committing fallacy number 4, the fallacy of security through obscurity. In other words, well, there's no way the bad guy could figure out how to get around some of these, strange esoteric things that we do in our organization. They can't possibly get around, multiple layers of, even though they're weak security, there's too many layers. The bad guy wouldn't bother. Forget it. The bad guys have shown us time and time again that these are all problems that we need to address properly. We need to match the risk level to what the bad guy is willing to be able to do, and we shouldn't be layering weak security controls after weak security controls. These are mistakes that unfortunately in this day and age we still see made.
And that kind of goes back to what you were saying about legacy systems and security. There's a fundamental flaw in how we approach security, and that's basically the bad guys are taking advantage of that.
I'll give you a really good example. You might remember Stuxnet
Yep.
virus. Well, the people in Bavaria at Siemens who created that very complicated controller device that was hacked through Stuxnet, those engineers basically said, "Well, the bad guys don't have the manual to this. This is a very complicated machine. even if they had network access to it, they wouldn't be able to figure out how to actually run it. Guess what? False. They did figure out how to use it,
Mm,
and
yep.
all manner of heck was caused by that very, very incorrect assumption.
Right. And yeah, so this kind of goes into the next fallacy of, node termination. I mean, once you're in, and Jason, this is where we're going to get a little more this is where we're going to get a little more into the technical side of fallacies. Um,
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the title, right, it says VPN over trust. I can tell you this, right? We've talked a lot on webinars and podcasts about concepts around zero trust. And to me, this is really what this category is about, which is, let's just go through these technical fallacies kind of quickly. In other words, a lot of people might say to themselves, you know what, I'm on a VPN, so therefore, from a cybersecurity standpoint, I'm good to go. I'm safe. Well, what happens if your node termination is at a VPN vendor
yep.
who is not got your best interests in mind? Well, are you safe? Well, remember, the VPN, all the VPN's really doing for you is encrypting that line of communication between yourself and wherever that node terminates. If that node terminates at some VPN vendor that is nefarious, you're in a lot of trouble. Never mind the coffee shop that you're at. Uh, it's not preventing you. Whenever you're using VPN, you have to ask yourself, who do I trust and who do I not trust? And unfortunately, sometimes the distrust has to happen at the node termination, and therefore, simply thinking that encryption or VPN gets you a free hall pass with security is a bad one.
And by the way, I actually want to get your thoughts on this, Jason, because it's in the name, virtual private network. We're not. This is about privacy. That's what a VPN does. Yes, it's making sure you're covering your tracks when you're going to a website, but it's really a privacy tool. It's not actually a security tool, and I want to get your thoughts on that.
It is private. Basically, it's creating privacy only through one layer, which is whoever it is that you're using as an access point. If you're at home, it's probably through your ISP. If you're at the coffee shop, it's whoever Starbucks is using as the ISP. In other words, if that's who you don't trust, that's why you're using the VPN. And so therefore, that's the privacy aspect. The problem is it's still not even privacy because you're not private at the node termination. So
Correct.
I would even say the word privacy is unfortunately still incorrect because it's only partially private through one layer. The entire concept of VPN almost needs to be retaught to people.
True. Yeah, it gives it gives you a false sense of security, really.
This is why it's a fallacy. The fallacy of node termination is a major problem. And I would say if we move on to number 6, fallacy of failing to isolate flat networks, here's a big problem that I've seen forever. A lot of enterprises are, very dependent on VPN, especially this day and age where we're all working from home. And unfortunately, a lot of enterprises have very flat networks. If somehow the credentials for that VPN of your employees are compromised, if you're in a world where you're not, you know, unfortunately, a lot of enterprises have their employees set up as administrators,
Mm,
and they can go from here to there and everywhere they want on that flat network. Unfortunately, a VPN can be a very bad idea. That is the fallacy of failing to isolate flat networks. I see a lot of CISOs who should know better, who are saying, well, my remote employees are on VPN, so I'm good. In other words, the node termination is me, so I trust the node termination. I'm not committing fallacy 5, but yes, you are committing fallacy 6. In other words, you are over credentialed within your network.
You're talking about privilege access management right there, and that's yep.
And so, therefore, right, this flows right into fallacy number 7, which is The nightmare scenario is always, are you providing adequate credential protection for your remote employees that are logging in? What happens if it's just username and password? Well, you're dealing with the same nightmare scenario as fallacy one. If your credentials happen to have MFA, well, what are you doing to prevent social engineering for people to not type in, their one-time passcode into a fake a fake screen, right? Either on a compromised node or even if it's taken from that in the middle. On and on and on. In other words, 5, 6, and 7, I don't think a lot of enterprise architects, security architects, have really thought about this hard enough. And that's really what leads to the finality of this, which is good old fashioned the principle of least privileges. In other words, if you've got people who are using VPN to get into your network, make sure that your HR employee and your finance employee and everybody else aren't administrators on the network, which unfortunately a lot of enterprises is true. You should minimize what those people are able to do. I know if you're a help desk person, it's a lot easier to just make everybody a bloody admin and it's fantastic, right? Interoperability, my network is just flying. Unfortunately, the bad guys know you're making a mistake, and it's a golden age for bad guys because of these 4 fallacies on this screen.
No, and actually, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this too. So I was reading recently about how a hacker can. So when you create when say say a sysadmin promotes into a computer, he's installing something for an employee, he's leaving a hash, and that hash can actually be manipulated by a bad guy to give him lateral movement across the network, and this is kind of what you're talking about.
The pass the hash attack, I think right now is 21 years old. So
If we're
I tell you
still
what,
doing it.
we don't really have the time to go into that, but I'll tell you what, for anybody listening to this who's curious, do a Google search on Benjamin Delpy and a bunch of other guys. It's called Pass the Hash Attack, and then realize what the nightmare scenario is about domain administrator type of people who do remote administration on people's desktops, dropping their hash into LSAS memory. And then if the bad guy gets a hold of that, that is your nightmare scenario as an enterprise. So check into it.
So the next one we want to talk about. Oh, sorry, guys. Go back. Next one we want to talk about is Did I go too far? Yes, I did. Nope.
There it
Apologies.
is, right there.
There
Number
you
9
go.
and 10.
Yep. Yeah, no. So now this is the category of threat detection. Now, this is one I'm not super familiar with. I've actually been trying to get my hands around this for a while. The proximity fallacy, essentially, is what we're going to be talking about here. And can you kind of we've talked in the past, Jason, I've read a lot of your stuff, and you talk about proximity. And when you mean proximity, do you mean, is this like internally people who already have access to your network, or people who are close to your people who may, I'm trying to understand this concept, and if you could go into detail, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think that's on the next page, to be honest with you.
Okay.
So we are definitely going to talk about that. I just want to hit these 2 first, and I think we could do it pretty quickly. 9 and 10. Number 9 is over reliance on antivirus, if you really want to make it oversimplified. In other words, I've got some sort of endpoint security solution that is trained by looking at attacks that have happened in the past. And I block list all of those things. In other words, I've got signatures of past malware samples, and that's great. The problem is this: the scale of malware caused by polymorphic changes. In other words, every time that there's an attack, there's a change in the way the attack occurs. That includes the way that the malware is formed, includes the techniques that the bad guys are using. So therefore, you cannot keep up with the scale. I definitely think that there's usage scenarios for things like antivirus. I'm not saying don't procure it. Far from that. What I am saying is don't over rely on it. That's the fallacy, is the over reliance. Thinking that your
Yeah.
endpoint solution is doing anything more than just dealing with sloppy or old malware, that's the mistake. And number 10 is sort of another side to that coin, which is thinking that somehow you're always going to be able to detect the bad guy. Well, what happens if that bad guy has stolen legitimate credentials? Well, that's it. They're in and they're doing legitimate things. How in the world do you detect them on your network doing legitimate things? You won't. So therefore, 9 and 10 work together. The over
Mhm.
reliance on endpoint solutions and the over reliance on like network monitoring. I think these are good layers, Greg.
Yeah.
Great layers. You should be buying these things. Just don't over rely on them.
So by anomaly, we're really talking about, and this is, I was actually wondering if you could give some tips on this, because this seems to be more of where the bad guys are going, and where we need to focus more on is the actual behaviors of, if a user is acting in a way that is not normal, and that should set off a red flag.
Sure, but what's normal and what's not normal?
Yeah.
I can tell you what, bad guys love to hide in printer spoolers, and I'll tell you why. It's because the size of the printer spooler binary, right, in the memory space keeps going up and down and up and down and up and down. How, what's the correct memory space for the printer spooler? Well, there is none. In other words, there is no normal to detect from. If the bad guy is logging into an HR system and downloading all the information about your employees, well, that's the same kind of behavior that your HR manager probably does on a daily basis. So what's weird about it?
Mm.
What's the anomaly? There is no anomaly.
Wow. No, that's sneaky. But and we only got a minimum amount of time, so we gotta get to the last ones. And I know I jumped the gun earlier, but we do want to go back to fallacy of proximity. And could you explain? I always struggle with what this means, but you say it perfectly. And could you explain, what do you mean by proximity? Are we talking about internal or external? Somebody near the network, like
No, I'll
physical
tell you
or
what. I'll
digital?
tell you what, Greg. I think there's a lot of very well-meaning and probably very intelligent CIOs and CISOs that are out there
Mhm.
who really truly believe still to this day, you know what? Anything that's in the cloud, that's too far for me. I can't go and look at that server rack and get the warm and fuzzy feeling that it's right beside me. Right? And
Yep.
because don't forget, fallacy 9 and 10 are related to this in the sense that because of the fact that I over rely probably on things like my endpoint solutions, I over rely on my ability to do anomaly detection. Since I have those controls in my enterprise network, anything that's on my enterprise network must be safer than stuff that's out in the cloud, right? That is the thinking. In other words, if it's close to me, I can keep an eye on it. The problem is this. uh, okay, wasn't that long ago we had the solar winds attack, right? Where
Seems
there
like
was a zero.
yesterday.
Right. There was a 0 day that the bad guys took advantage of. I'll never forget Kevin Mandia's comments when asked about it because I think it was his team that were the original ones who kind of discovered it. Think about this for a moment, Greg.
Yep.
Right? Kevin Mandia's team, probably the smartest cybersecurity people in the world, not too many exceptions. Those guys were scratching their heads as to how in the world did the bad guy get in? And it turned out it was because of a trusted appliance on their premises. In other words,
Oh, all right.
they, Kevin Mandia's team, committed the fallacy of proximity. In other words, because that box is in house, there's no way the bad guy's going to touch this. And even if they do, we'll be the first to figure it out. Well, to their credit, because they're such smart guys, they did figure it out. But there was a moment where they scratched their heads. Well, if Kevin Mandia's team scratching their heads, what hope do the rest of us have?
Well, we're all human, and I think that this kind of ties into the human factor in this all. Is like, even you could be the best data security professional in the world, but the bad guys can use that against you as well. They can use your own intelligence against you.
I'll tell you what, Greg, this, I have to make the comment. If you are running a Microsoft CA for your PKI simply because it's on premise and it makes you warm and fuzzy that it's on premise, guess what? There has been an enormous amount of research about easy misconfigurations that would allow the bad guy to do all kinds of nightmare scenarios. And proximity gets you nothing.
Wow. I love that fallacy, and we got to move on from this one, but I love that fallacy. We definitely got to talk about this more. I want to hear it more in a podcast because I think this is probably one of the most damaging fallacies out there. But this kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier with legacy stuff, but credential use. And let me know if I'm wrong, but you know, what are the credentials? How are they getting access to these things? And how does this tie around usability and visibility?
Let me give you a really good example of this fallacy number, what we're labeling number 13 here. Um, One of the things, Greg, you might have seen quite often recently, especially in the world of DevOps, is there have been Ansible scripts, Chef and Puppet scripts, where not only username and passwords have been hard coded into the scripts, but so have private keys.
Hmm.
Right. So, in other words, like right now, there's an enormous number of ways to hang yourself, which is never ever use these form factors that are copy and pastable into another form. In other words, we have best practices, especially in asymmetric forms of secret keeping. PKI being a really good example, where the private key never has to leave your TPM. The private key never has to leave your secure enclave. Right? These are security best practices that have now proven themselves to be just the right way to do things. Unfortunately, we see people who are perhaps inexperienced in security, sometimes even people who should know better, who are allowing their credentials to be in places that they are not. Thankfully, and this is, I don't want to touch on this too much, but there's going to be a corollary piece to this presentation today, Greg, which is
Mhm.
what are some of the security bright lights that we're seeing? And for this specific fallacy, number 13, failing to protect the form factor, we now have concepts such as credential vaults, which defeat this fallacy completely. And so therefore, thankfully, we are seeing technologies that, that defeat this. This is great.
Yeah.
And it leads directly into fallacy 14, which I just want to touch on quick, which is basically it's hard. I'm going to go right back to the first thing I said. Security is hard. And so therefore, if you have to do something like, say, robotic process automation, RPA, and you've got a lot of logging in to do, a ton of different kinds of authentication, well, my goodness, the usability of those credentials, of course, you're just going to script it because that's what's making your life easy. Your Ansible script is making your life easy, so just throw the bloody credentials in there. Or is it a better idea to use an abstraction layer such as something that's managing those credentials, such as a credential vault? That is, that all leads up to this whole idea of governance and visibility and managed credentials.
Yeah, and I liked how you said in the podcast, and if nobody's checked out the podcast, check out Root Causes podcast with Tim and Jason. They go a lot deeper into this, but you're basically talking about the fallacy of scale there. And hey, if you could just touch upon that really quickly, because I think that's really important. And I was really mesmerized by what you and Tim were talking about on the podcast around this.
Remember back in the day, Greg, when if you set up a website, all you had to deal with was one SSL cert.
Yep.
That probably wasn't even that long ago. Probably, the amount of
I was
digital
probably a
identities,
youngin' then, by the way.
the amount of digital identities that you had to deal with was almost at the scale where you could just throw it all in a spreadsheet and deal with it. Unfortunately, today, just take a look at DevOps alone. How many containers do you have out there? Each one of them needing probably a TLS certificate every, I don't know, minute, every hour, every 2 hours. Multiply that by a year of time. How many tens of thousands of identities is that? How in the world can you deal with that scale in an unmanaged credential situation? You simply cannot. In other words, again, it's a golden age for the bad guy because the bad guy knows you're probably not doing a lot at this point in history to have full visibility to what you're issuing. Thankfully, technologies have advanced to the point where you can have visibility. You can have governance for this. It's here. The technology is here now, thankfully, and it's caught up. But there was a period of time where people were just opening up, private CAs with OpenSSL and having zero visibility. And that machine was running underneath somebody's desk, and it was a CISO's worst nightmare. That's a problem of scale, Greg, that I think is going to continue into use cases that you and I can't even dream up right now that are going to be
Yeah.
true in 4 to 5 years.
It's fascinating, but also scary stuff. But as I said, totally check out Jason Soroko and Tim Callan, their Root Causes podcast. You can check it out on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher. You see it here, and yeah. But thank you so much, Jason. But while we have a little time left, we definitely want to get to questions. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Kristen. And what do we got?
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we did get a couple of questions. So, and I think you guys actually touched on this one. What is your viewpoint regarding the use of a web service to store all of your passwords?
Right. So therefore, we're talking about putting your credentials out in the cloud potentially, right? If you're talking about a web service, I would say one of the best things about it is you can monitor what is getting access to that. The ability then is you can have distributed computing. In other words, you can have compute power that it's out on multiple public clouds that are then accessing the credentials they need in a place that can be monitored properly and it's all isolated out. The chances of having those credentials just spilling all over the place is reduced to an absolute minimum or zero. In other words, it's a single point of failure, but it's a single point of measurement and single point of place that you have to govern. So therefore, I think that the best practice right now is using some form of credential vault, which is another way of saying what I think that what that question is becoming quickly a best practice. And if you look at any of the major vendors out there, all of them have some form of credential vault. You're going to see that not just in the DevOps world, but in the RPA world and in other future use cases in the near future. So I'm a big proponent of it.
I have a question for you, Jason, actually, around that. Do you think that may cause a single vector of attack?
Well, you know what? You've absolutely got to get your API right and making sure you're not releasing things. In other words, all the best practices around using a pen testing team to check on that and using good development best practices, using languages like Rust as an example, rather than C++, as good as that language was. Unfortunately, things like buffer errors are still a reality with us. There's what I love about it is you the amount of control you have limited resources, Greg. You have limited resources. So therefore, being able to put those substantial but limited resources against a single thing, I think allows you to at least have that one control saying,
Yeah.
look, guys, nothing, if anything comes out of here, at least I know what's going to come out of here. And secondly, at least I'm going to have some ability to know I can draw the chalk line around the body because right now you don't have that option. If credentials start to spill, you don't even know where the body is anymore. This is the next step is defining your risk.
That was great. Thanks, guys. Next question. So you refer to problems with Active Directory, but are you referring to the Azure Active Directory?
You know what? Azure Active Directory is there's differences with the Active Directory we all know and love in our enterprise networks. There's different functionalities that are involved, and I would invite anybody who is asking that question to take a look at the white hat research on this, which is Greg had asked the question about the pass the hash attack. That's always in flux, right? Because Microsoft comes out with various controls. You need to know what those controls are, but then, give it till the next black hat, and Benjamin Delpy probably has one or two ways around it, right? So, in other words, I think the kinds of research you need to do in how to mitigate Active Directory attacks, in the traditional sense, I think you need to keep up with how are you configuring Azure Active Directory to help to avoid some of its problems as well. You know what? I could go into this probably in a whole other presentation. I think for anybody asking that question, keep up on the research. Find out what guys like Benjamin Delpy are saying. Keep up on what Microsoft is saying about how to mitigate these problems and stay as patched as possible. It's tough out there, guys, but you got to do your homework.
Thanks, Jason. Next, we have my enterprise VPN node terminates within my corporate network. Isn't that the safest
It probably
option?
is. So therefore, you're not committing the fallacy of node termination, right? In other words, you're gonna trust yourself. That's probably the best idea possible. But if you refer back to what I said, the other three fallacies in that VPN fallacy category are things you need to make sure you're not committing. In other words, are you making sure that all of your employees are not administrators? Those are the next set of questions that you need to ask. Bravo that you're not committing that one fallacy. Make sure you're not committing the other three.
Check out your group policies. It really is what it comes down to.
Yep.
Great. And last question for y'all today. We have network isolation gets everyone upset in my enterprise. What do I do instead?
Wow. Network isolate. So that basically means that you've probably have developers in your company who want to be able to have access to parts of the network that maybe they should or shouldn't. I doubt that anybody in the HR department or finance department are complaining because they don't need to go off and touch the crown jewels. They've got a defined job to do, and they typically don't mind being boxed in to just being able to do that job. Typically, it's your IT people, but your IT people should be walking around with credentials that are very, very carefully defined and short-lived. What that leaves us with is those developers who want to have a lot more access. What I would say is, you know what? Give those guys their own cloud instance and say, have at
Yep.
it, right? Like in other words, you if they're doing things in the corporate network that are essentially tests, as if saying, you know what, I'm going to eat my own dog food within my own enterprise network. Therefore, I need access to other parts of my enterprise network. What you should do is create them their own test bed enterprise network. So there's many ways to do that in all three public clouds, and there's even ways to do that within your own corporate network to basically simulate a corporate network. Don't use the real thing for experimentation, Kristen.
Thank you, Jason. Well, that wraps it up for today, guys. As always, thank you, Jason. Greg, it was great having you on today, and
Pleasure.
thank everyone for joining us.
Take care.
Take it easy.
Great. Thanks.